Hello, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be taking a whirlwind tour through the life of Charles Cater Jacobs, who was a reformatory schoolboy. So we're going to be looking at his life, his time in the school, and the importance of those school records. Now we're going to imagine that Charles is our ancestor, and the first time we find Charles Cater Jacobs is on the 1891 census at Calder Farm Reformatory. So as we can see, he's aged 16 years old. He was born in Sheffield and is an inmate of the Reformatory. Not a lot of information, but it can help us confirm previous documents or records. So going back 10 years, we can find Charles, now aged just 5 years old, living at home with his parents, William, who's a coal miner, and Maria, his mother, as well as his younger siblings, Ellen and Samuel. Now, using this information, we can go back to find his baptism on the Attercliffe Baptism Register on the 18th of October 1875, where we can see his parents again, William Cater Jacobs. So the middle name Cater seems to be inherited from his father and Maria. So that confirms the record for us, and we can see that they're living at Steadfast Street and that William is still working in the mining industry. Now, the baptism notes that he was born on the 1st of August 1875, and you'll notice on the far left there we have a PB, which implies that it was a private baptism. So why did young Charles Cater Jacobs end up in a reformatory school, and what was his life like? Well, Calder Farm Reformatory was based at Sands Lane, Murfield near Huddersfield. It opened in 1855, and just 4 years later it had 110 boys. Now, Charles was there from June 1888 until July 1893. The aim of the reformatory was to reform the character of the boys in its care, who just mainly committed petty crimes. So what did Charles do to warrant being sent there? Well, the admission registers for Calder Farm Reformatory are available on Ancestry, and they give us our first actual glimpse of young Charles Cater Jacobs. Here's a photo taken of him as an inmate at the school. Now, very few reformatory school records have been digitised, but these have. You'll find most records still reside in the local archives, and sadly they're rarely accessed. So let's take a closer look at these couple of pages here of Charles's record and see what we can find out about him. So we see that Charles was admitted from Her Majesty's Prison Wakefield. He was aged just 12 years old. He's given us born in Sheffield, and he was living at 23 Swan Street. Now, interestingly, Wakefield Prison actually featured also in Charles's father's life story. His father, William Jacobs, was sentenced to 10 days or payment of £2.17 for non-payment of a debt back in 1885. So it would be 3 years later that Charles would follow his father and be incarcerated in Wakefield Prison. Now, back to Charles's reformatory admission record. Well, as you can see, the admissions registers can give you lots of useful information. We find that he has previous convictions for stealing money from his parents. His offence this time was for stealing £1.17, quite a large amount at that time, from his father. Now, quite often these petty thefts were against family members, and when it seems that the family eventually just got fed up and decided he needed to be taught a lesson. Then we have the details of where the court was held and his sentence, which was to be 21 days, as we say, in Wakefield Prison, followed by 5 years in Calder Farm Reformatory. Now, admissions registers often give education information, so we can see at the top there that Charles could read, albeit imperfectly, but he couldn't write at all. It tells us a little further down that he was attending Carbrook National School, and he was in the bottom class and described as a very indifferent scholar. Now, his parents' names are given at the top there. We have John Cater Jacobs and Maria. And we can also see that it tells us they were primitive Methodists. The record also confirms, just a little bit further down, that he was baptised at home, hence why the baptism record said PB, you'll remember. And then we have the fact that he has no occupation and that he's not a vagrant on there as well. If we continue down the page, we see that Charles gave a statement, and he said, "I stole the money from a box upstairs during my parents' absence. I then went to Manchester for 3 days and returned home and my father caused me then to be apprehended. Now, interestingly, you'll see his character is described as good, under parental control, but it also says he's been harshly treated sometimes by his father, so it sounds like he's been getting himself into trouble a little bit. Now, the last box, other relations, is very useful. It's quite small, so I'll enlarge it for you. Now, we can see his uncles and aunts, as well as his grandmother, along with their addresses. Now, this is useful, as you'll see that although Charles's surname is Jacobs, none of these relations have that name. So they're either from his mother's line or they're Jacobs who have married. And you'll see it also gives us their occupations as well. So some key pointers going forwards, trying to find other family members. On the next page, we also got a description of young Charles. So we get his date of birth, we get his height. In fact, he's got a light complexion, light brown hair and blue eyes. And then any marks that are on him, such as scars. So hopefully you can see how useful these admissions registers are. We're giving not only information about Charles himself, but also his family, his background, and any other crimes. There's also, of course, the prison register from HMS Wakefield detailing similar information. And his case even warranted a mention in the local newspaper. So we see there it tells the story about on Monday last his mother placed £1.18 and 1.5 pence in a tea box in her bedroom, and shortly afterwards left the house in charge of the lad and his sister. And when she returned, she discovered, with the exception of 7.5p, he'd taken all the money. Quite why he left the 7.5p. He might have taken a lot, wouldn't he? So the police were informed, and basically he was arrested. So what was Calder Farm Reformatory like? Well, the regime was not an easy one. It was almost based on military style living, but the boys would mostly benefited from better care and education than they would have done outside of the school. On Sunday mornings at 6 o'clock, the boys would march on the nearby fields accompanied by a bugler. They attended classes, as you can see here. They learned trades, and if they did happen to be ill, you see there was a little infirmary there with a nurse even. There was a mark system which enabled the boys to earn money, so 4p a week. If they did extra work, they got 8p or 10p a week. And punishments were frequently in the form of a fine, so it was an incentive to be well behaved, to earn some little bit of money. Now, you might have thought it was all hard work and no play at the Reformatory, but in 1898, which was just 5 years after Charles actually left the Reformatory, there was an experimental summer camp set up on the hillside nearby. So all the school buildings were closed for 2 weeks, and at the time there were 83 boys there, and they lived in these great big bell tents, and there was a big marquee for all the stores. However, the boys still had to parade for drill at 6 o'clock. They had breakfast at 8 o'clock. Then they split up into 3 groups, so they either did their workshops, they did some farm pursuits, or they had recreation. Then at noon they stopped for half an hour lunch. Then they had an hour's fun and games before work commenced again. And then at 6 o'clock they stopped for tea, and after that they would play cricket or other games into the evening. Now, the summer camp concluded with a sports day, and it was such a success it was repeated in later years. There was a report in 1889 which gives us a good idea of what the school was like, and the overall summation was that it was generally very good. The boys were well treated. There was a farm which had 25 cows, 3 horses and 16 pigs. The boys were actively learning trades which would hopefully help them find work when they were released. There was even a brass band, and this was often how some of the boys managed to enter into the military upon their release. It also stated that in the last 3 years, of 98 boys who had been discharged, only 6 had been reconvicted. So it seems like Reformatory really was working for those boys. So on the 11th of July 1893, Charles Cater Jacobs was discharged. You can see from the discharge register here. But the register not only notes his discharge, but also follows up on him in later years. So the following year, in 1894, Charles visited the school, said he was doing well, and he was in the 2nd East Yorkshire Regiment at the barracks in Preston. Quite useful for us to know to go and look for military records now. The following year, in 1895, the police reported he was still in the regiment, he was doing well, and we have a little note over there for 1904 that says there was an amount due of 2 and 6. Now that appears to be what was termed as reward money. It was often given to the lads when they left the school if they managed to maintain employment and basically just stay out of trouble. So it was a little incentive to them. Now we know he joined the army, so we can go and find his military record. So here we see on the 15th of January 1894, aged 18, he's joined the East Yorkshire Regiment. Now he's working as a labourer, and interestingly he says he's never been imprisoned. Still not very honest, obviously. Again, we have his description, so he's grown somewhat, if you remember the description from his school record, and he's still a Methodist. And we have his full service history, but this is the summary, and this total, as it says, 13 years and 102 days. And as we can see, he spent time not only in England, but also in Egypt and India. We also have his next of kin's details, which are for his mother, who appears to have moved around, and actually has a change in name, so it appears she's remarried at some point. So Charles left the army in April 1907, and we then find him just 4 years later on the 1911 census. He's now 35 years old and working as a carter at the sewage works, where he would most likely have been transporting materials and waste necessary for the operation of the actual sewage works itself. 3 years later, on the 19th of September 1914 at Thurnscoe Parish Church, he marries Mary Elizabeth Bennett, who was a widow, having previously been married to a Tom Bennett, who had died. She was also from a mining family. 7 years later, in 1921, we find Charles and Mary are still living at Chapel Street, and he's now a colliery carter working at Hickleton Main Colliery, which was a coal mine in Thurnscoe, South Yorkshire, from 1892 until it closed in 1988. 7 years later, Charles and Mary are still living at the same address, as we see from this electoral register entry. And this is actually the last record from Mary Elizabeth Jacobs, as she died at the end of 1928. Charles himself passed away on the 20th of August 1930, aged just 54. He was still working at the colliery as a surface worker, and he died of, I think we call it tabes dorsalis, which is a disease basically where the back part of the spinal cord gets damaged over time. One can only imagine how hard the life of the carter would have been. It was fairly tough. Now he died at Southmore House, which was actually a workhouse from 1858 until 1930, so it may well still have been a workhouse at that time. But in 1930 the workhouse became a public assistance institution, which mainly provided accommodation for the elderly. So he's just there on the crossover of that. And as we can see, we have his burial record, where he was buried in Hemsworth just 3 days later. And what became of Calder Farm Reformatory? Well, the school, which opened its doors in 1855, eventually closed in 1922. Over the years it was extended, so you can see the map on the left there, 1907, back go forwards in time to 1933 map there. It was actually 1909 that they built a large red brick block to extend the property. It's rather huge. So you can see the new building in the later map there on the right hand side. And we actually have a picture of that new block. So here we can see it in 2022. It survived the passage of time and is being advertised as a development site. Be an interesting project if this turns into housing, wouldn't it, to realise that you were living in the buildings of an old reformatory school. So I hope you've enjoyed our journey today, looking at the life of young Charles Cater Jacobs. You've seen the value that the reformatory school records can give to your research. They're such an underused resource, and they can give you so much information. They give you the background, they give you parents' details, lots of information like that. But even after the children were discharged, you'll see there's information going forward. So you can find people in the military, you can find if they've moved, you can find what occupations they took on after they left the school. So if there's a reformatory school anywhere near where your ancestors lived, hopefully you'll be tempted to go and pop along to the archives and see if they're in those records. Thank you for joining me today. It's been my pleasure to tell you the story of Charles Cater Jacobs. Thank you.